In this video, I want to talk about the race myth and also suggest a way forward, which is really, I think, a way out of this endless cycle of injustice and recrimination and self-flagellation in which we find ourselves. And I call it a myth, and I want to talk about it that way. And I think as a historian, as someone who makes a living studying and reading about, teaching history, it's not uncommon to come across a number of myths, some of them much more powerful than others. For instance, one that still persists in modern day is what we call the myth of the lost cause, this notion that somehow the American Civil War began and was fought without any meaningful reference to the institution of slavery. In other words, it's a retrospective ennobling of the Confederate cause, and something that was affected after the Civil War, largely for the purposes of reconciliation. If you want to bring the country back together again, North and South, one way to do that is to agree upon a kind of a shared narrative that is very loosely rooted in the actual history of the 1850s and 60s, a shared narrative which holds something like the Confederate States of America withdrew from the Union when pressed upon by potentially tyrannical federal government, and did so largely in defense of something called states' rights. And that's what we call sanitizing the war's origins, when in reality all of the evidence, and I mean all of the evidence from the 1850s and 1860 itself, points to slavery and the desire to not only perpetuate but to expand the institution of slavery, extend it across the continent, compel, if possible, Northerners to drop their moral opposition to slavery and to embrace it as what Senator John C. Calhoun called a positive good. Okay, that's what the evidence shows, but the myth is something entirely different. The myth tells us that the war began for other reasons, that Confederates fought for other reasons, and that myth served its purpose, which was as a kind of an alternative narrative to an embarrassing truth. And again, I think it persists to this day with some fairly unfortunate consequences. But I think another myth is something we've heard a lot in recent days, that racism is America's original sin. And I don't think that's true. I think slavery is America's original sin, and that racism certainly was used to justify slavery. Those things are inarguable. But it was the institution of chattel slavery that was, as Edmund Burke very eloquently said in 1775, that was imposed upon the American colonies by the British Empire, which in the 18th century was the largest slave trader in the Atlantic world. That was America's original sin. And where Americans failed was in not living up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and later turning those ideals on their head, and in fact embracing slavery and inequality as something that was fundamentally American, when in truth it was the exact opposite. And to give the British their due, in later decades, in the 1830s and thereabouts, it was the Royal Navy that helped police the prohibitions on the transatlantic slave trade, while Americans did relatively little on that. So where the British were culpable in an earlier century, they certainly attempted to atone for it. And I don't think racism It's not to say that it wasn't a sin, but I'm saying it's not uniquely American. Racism is a human sin. It's something that has plagued human beings. Just you don't have to go back that far. Just in the modern world, I mean, go back to World War II, the most obvious case, of course, the Nazi racial ideology, which of course inspired the ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union, ill-fated at least in terms of Germany's ultimate wartime fortunes, but certainly not ill-fated in terms of allowing the Nazis to carry out what was inarguably the key component of their entire program, which was the extermination of those they called Untermenschen, or subhuman. That, of course, included the Jews, but also other ethnic groups and people of various descriptions whom the Nazis didn't care for, all across Eastern and Southern Europe and Russia. And then, of course, at the same time, the Japanese occupied China, murdered tens of millions, well, I should say upwards of probably 15, 16, 17 million Chinese civilians, and did so with intense and unapologetic racial animus toward the Chinese. And of course, the Chinese or the Japanese viewed that as revenge for centuries of Chinese racial animus toward the Japanese. The Chinese for centuries had called the Japanese "wo," or little people. And so the Japanese had their own racial epithets for the Chinese. You can go back across, again, you don't have to go just through the 20th century, the modern world, okay, when people of these different complexions started coming together. Even then, okay, when we had, some fairly good results and others that were more or less catastrophic, even then, there's no escaping the fundamental truth that more people of European descent, or what we would call white people or people of lighter complexions, were murdered by other people of that same description than they were by people who traced their ancestry to somewhere other than Europe, or had darker complexions. Same was true of Africans. More Africans or people of African descent were murdered by other people of that same description. And the same is true of Asians and Middle Easterners. And all of those, in all of those cases, there were racial elements. There was Hitler's lunatic invention of a Jewish race, but all of those antagonisms had some deeper, purportedly biological or natural or ethnic cause to them. And often the result has been mass murder, what we call genocide, whether it was the Armenian genocide of World War I and the post-World War I era, whether it was Cambodia, Rwanda, or very recently, of course, the attempted extermination and subsequent enslavement, or I should say corresponding enslavement of many Yazidis in northern Iraq by ISIS. This is a human condition. It's not something. So when we say Americans need to wrestle with their original sin, I don't think that's quite true, and I don't think it's terribly helpful. It's part of the human. It's one of the darkest sides of the human experience and of our collective past that I don't think is going to be eradicated by. Certainly, the past isn't going to be changed, but the future won't be changed either, simply by making these kinds of platitudinous appeals to some people, to certain segments of America, to examine their whatever, their past, their privilege. That's not going to do it. In fact, I think that's likely to have the exact opposite effect of the one that its adherents purport to prefer. So I think it's best that we instead talk about race for what it really is, which is the ultimate myth. We should know, I mean, we do know, biologically, there is no such thing as race. Okay? There's a human race, and that's it. No sane person would argue that the color of one's skin is a determinative factor in terms of one's anything, one's faculties, one's character, any sort of qualities. That's an insane notion biologically. It's not. We wouldn't divide people by eye color. We wouldn't divide them by hair color, and put those people into different groups, and say, well, you people have been antagonizing these people, and I mean, it's patently absurd. Now, we can't eliminate race from our lexicon because we need that word and we need that concept to understand the past, and particularly the follies of the past. But I think far better than continuing to divide people into these groups and to talk about them that way, which is truly in a mythical way. I mean, it is a falsehood to say that there is such a thing as race other than the human race. It's counterproductive, and it's potentially dangerous because, again, I think it keeps bringing us back to this endless cycle of injustice, recrimination, and self-flagellation that I mentioned in the very beginning. And so I think the way forward is to start teaching kids, because kids they're amenable to this. They're agreeable. They don't want to see all of these differences. That's not natural to them. They're taught those things, unfortunately. Okay? So you teach them that there is no such thing as race, and we move forward understanding that it's part of the past, but that it's not going to be part of the future. And that's going to require some changes in the way that we think. It's going to require some changes in the way that we talk. For instance, I don't think we should put it on applications anymore. I don't want to know in November who wins the quote-unquote black vote or who wins among white women, as if all those people have some shared interest or monolithic way of thinking. It's absurd. And that's going to require that we stop talking in terms of diversity and that we start talking in terms of equality. The answer is right there. It's in our American creed. All men are created equal. All we have to do is update that. All human beings are created equal. We all have natural rights. Okay? And we create government to protect those rights. Okay? And we endow that government with powers, and that government acts only by our consent. I think maybe it wouldn't even be such a bad idea to add the race myth to those self-evident truths. If we just say there is no such thing as race, I don't care. I don't even think Jefferson would care. Just add it to the Declaration of Independence. Just put that little superscript, and oh, by the way, there is no such thing as race. It's far better than the approach that we have taken, which I think is well intended on the part of many people, although I'm very suspicious of the motives and the behavior of others, for whom I think it's a regular opportunity to signal what they perceive to be their own intellectual and moral superiority to their fellow human beings. But for the mass of people who really want to see things get better moving forward, race does not exist. Race is a myth.